Athenian. The fifth chapter of this letter is of particular relevance here, depicting the trials of Christians living in a hostile world. It is on this chapter and its context that I focus in what follows. In short, the chapter sketches the contours of an outdoors tension between Christians and non-Christians, which it undertakes to dismantle by persuading the opponents that difference should not be construed as antagonism. I have abundantly or made abundant use of this outdoors indoors thing because of something that has to do with the language of the time, maybe not necessarily the terminology used in the 2nd century, but later in 3rd and 4th centuries, let alone in the Byzantine era, they kept referring to the non-Christian culture, the classical culture, as therathen, out of the doors, outside the doors. So it's my way of making reference to that kind of line drawn between us Christians and the rest of the world. Scholars believe that later Christians totally ignored the letter to Diognetus. Echoing this view, Bart Ehrman affirms that it was never mentioned, let alone cited by any of the church fathers. True, explicit references to this writing are missing. That said, I contest the established opinion on grounds of the striking similarities between the 5th chapter of Diognetus and a 4th century anonymous work attributed to Macarius the Great, Spiritual Homilies, particularly the 5th one in this collection. So I won't be saying Macarius, I won't be saying Pseudo Macarius, I won't be saying Simeon, Macarius Simeon, attributed to Macarius. Either through direct or indirect borrowing, the 5th Macarian homily rehearses Dionysian images and vocabulary, but with a twist. It renders the external tension of the letter as occurring with the Christian household, indoors as it were. In addition, it presents the two concerned parties in a seemingly sharper contrast than Diognetus did. My aim is to bring to the fore how the outdoors 2nd century line of division has become an indoors matter in the 4th century. In so doing, I bring a corrective to the established view by proving that Diognetus was not altogether forgotten within tradition. And we move to the first section, an outdoors conflict. Chapter 6 of the letter formulates the Christian condition paradoxically. Christians dwell in the world but are not of the world. This line summarizes the message of the entire letter, suggesting that Christians are not easy to define. Since they dwell in the world, Christians are not unlocalized and antisocial. However, since they are not of the world, theirs differ from the beliefs and customs of the opponents. In what follows, I consider both aspects of this paradoxical situation. Diognetus undertakes to ease the tension, maintaining that Christians are not against the world, society, and culture, not by default anyway. They do not cultivate the fact of being different, at least regarding the external aspects of life. As read in chapter 5, Christians do not differ from the rest of people by land or language or their habits, for nowhere do they dwell in cities of their own, nor do they employ some unusual language, nor do they practice a strange lifestyle. To affirm Christian identity is not a matter of abandoning culture and society in order to build an ideal world. The above excerpt shows that Christians participate in all the outward aspects of everyday life together with their compatriots. And so, as followers of the local customs, they are immanent to their context, sharing in its language and culture. According to Judith Liu, for Diognetus, social separation is not a Christian characteristic. And in fact, the letter emphasizes that Christians' lifestyle remains unseen to the outsiders, hidden like the soul within a body. That's a beautiful image that the editor, the modern editor of the work, Maru, considers one of the most beautiful images in the early Christian literature and a unique image. This means that Christianity is first and foremost an interiorized commitment to Christ, not an antagonizing display of differences. That said, their immanence to the world does not mean complete homogenization. Again, in chapter 5 we read, whereas they, that is Christians, live in either Greek or barbarian cities, depending on their lot, and follow the local customs in regards to clothing, food, and the other aspects of life, they display, however, an astonishing and admittedly paradoxical condition of their way of life. Alongside the reassuring reference to Christians as neighborly adjustment, the letter points out that Christian identity remains irreducible to the broader context. What differentiates Christians are indeed not external features such as food, clothing, and customs, but the motivations behind Christian polity are nevertheless strange and unique. The outlines of attention emerge. Already in chapter 5, the mystery of Christian reverence differs from, I quote, the idle pursuit and arrogance of the Jews, end of quote. Similarly, chapter 5 contrasts the pagan lifestyle, quote again, the thought and teaching of people burdened by many worries, and the Christian ethos, which draws, we read in chapter 7, on a divine source, Christ the Logos, not human opinion. Corresponding to its divine source, Christian polity is theologically conditioned and as such transcends any given framework. There's the paradox. Christians are geographically, historically, and culturally localized, but their mindset and lifestyle are not bound by the categories of space, time, ethnicity, culture, and language. According to Henri Irénée Marot, the status of Christians in the world entails the synthesis of immanence and transcendence. Christians are, like God, above any narrow frame of reference, there and nowhere, unlocalized and cosmopolitan. This strange condition has to do with their mode of being. As Johann Eger Jr. summarizes the message of Diognetus, quote, the difference between them, Christians, and the world rests on modality and not on spatiality or temporality. Therefore, it depends on the tropos, mode, not on the topos, place, or the chronos, time. Christians are located neither elsewhere nor in another time. They actualize their status of God's children through grace, neither beyond here nor in the future, but in the here and now, albeit behaving in a different way from all others. According to Eger, Diognetus proposes a balance between localization and difference, detachment from and involvement with the context, a situation which can be properly understood only in existential and or behavioral terms. As we read in Diognetus 5, Christians, I quote, reside on earth but live as though in heaven, end of quote, and I'll be returning to this phrase later on. On this note, I turn to the aspect of difference. The existential strangeness of Christians transpires through a cluster of paradoxes. Chapter 5 offers several such examples. Although living in their countries, they are like foreigners. They participate in everything as citizens, but endure all things as strangers. Any foreign country is theirs, and any homeland foreign. Paraphrasing Lewis' words, Christians appear as crucified between their internal self-identity and the external observed identity. The status of being there but not belonging anywhere, observes George Florovsky, echoes the words of the Lord in John 8:23, John 17:14-16, and other scriptural passages such as the second letter to Corinthians, chapter 6, verses 9-10. According to R.G. Tanner, there are obvious here likewise reverberations of the Stoic universal world society and the Epicurean need to live in hiding, two classical standpoints situated at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Whether scriptural or philosophical, or rather both, this depiction points to a dramatic tension which originates in Christians' sense of difference from their context. Chapter 5 reasserts the difference in ethical terms that evoke the common charges of licentiousness leveled at Christians by their opponents. I quote, dwelling in the flesh but not living according to the flesh, end of quote. Christians marry and have children like all do, yet they neither destroy their offspring nor share their spouses. Their participation in the natural rhythms of life does not preclude Christians from fully affirming their identity, despite they being misunderstood, marginalized, and even persecuted and put to death because of their strangeness. Throughout Diognetus, the paradoxical status of Christian identity is inextricably linked to martyrdom. The conflict is obviously present, but according to the letter, it is only inadvertently and indirectly triggered by Christians given their faithfulness to a different ethos. As they do not seek to affirm their difference, they never retaliate either. Instead, they, I quote, love everybody although they are persecuted by all, and also do good whilst they are punished as evildoers, end quote. The author reflects further on this positive attitude in chapter 6, where he or she, an anonymous letter, develops the celebrated analogy of Christians as the soul of the world. I think this is something that we could look at more seriously in this anonymity in many early Christian texts. My hunch is that many of these anonymous authors were women. Apart from some extreme humility on the part of some males, which isn't something that characterizes most of us, not me. I see no point in this anonymity. It's something to explore. Who knows what we can find. Before moving to Macarius' fifth spiritual homily, so I missed one. I must briefly consider Lewis' understanding of the paradoxical condition of Christians in Diognetus. Luke discerns two nuances entailed in the Diognetan representation of Christian identity. There is the internal self-identity, clearly defined and separate, and the external observed identity, denoting a lack of visible differentiation. Both aspects pertain to a highly articulated meta-identity, which incorporates Jewish and Gentile elements. So I'm doing a summary of Lewis' position. Christian identity, she maintains further, builds by inclusion, amounting to a cultural syncretism that does not leave much room for originality, or, as the author of Diognetus prefers, newness. Lewis' interpretation is partly acceptable in that the Jewish and Gentile origin of certain Christian traits is unmistakable. But her interpretation cannot account for the attacks of both Jews and Gentiles on Christians, at least at the time. Neither does it provide an explanation for Diognetus' contrast between Christians and other traditions. Lewis' reduction of meta-identity to inclusivity does not truthfully represent the concerns of the author. Laboring to affirm Christian distinctiveness and superiority to pre-existent lifestyles, Diognetus does not favor inclusivity. Well, not as such, not per se. Ultimately, Diognetan meta-identity amounts to affirming Christianity's newness and freedom from the cultural features presupposed by its localization. Yes, Christian identity includes, but it likewise surpasses neighborly parameters, for instance in the clear affirmation of loving the oppressors, which is something that actually Lou misses altogether in the chapter dedicated in her book to Diognetus. There's no reference to love, whereas Christian love is one of the hallmarks of the message of the letter. It's what makes Christianity distinct. For Diognetus, Christians shared in the space, language, and culture of their compatriots, but their ultimate point of reference was not of this world. The parties being incommensurable, there was no cause for conflict. And this is something that usually is ignored by the scholars of Diognetus. They believe that the letter is typically apologetic tract or whatever, writing, cultural warfare, cultural war, and stuff like that. Whereas Diognetus is far subtler than that. Yes, there is a description of a conflict there, but the conflict is somehow dismantled, at least in the argument of the author. Moving to the second section, an endorsed conflict, and I'll be referring to the Macarian homilies. The fifth homily in the collection of Macarian spiritual writings rehearses the topic and phraseology of Diognetus in a very original way, in theorizing the conflict. Following that Diognetus, the homily contrasts the vain thoughts and worldly people and the ethos of Christians who, guided by their, I quote, fellowship and participation in the Holy Spirit, abide in a heavenly mindset and gaze upon eternal goods. So Christians have a sort of transcendental cast of mind. The reference to Christians abiding in a heavenly mindset echoes the Diognetan the theme of living as though in heaven, a phrase which rehearses in turn Philippians 3:20. And a phrase which is also quoted by the homily of interest, a little before the above lines, in chapter 3, thus confirming its relation with Diognetus. This relation is not broken by the reference within the homily to the Spirit as the source of Christianity's ethos instead of the Dionysian logos. The idea remains the same. Christians draw on divine, not human wisdom. Like in the letter, this difference has an impact on lifestyle. We read in chapter 1. The world of Christians is different, which means that their behavior, mindset, manner of speech, and activity happen to be different. Likewise, the behavior, the mindset, the manner of speech, and activity of the people of this world are different. It appears that the Christians and the people of this world live in parallel universes, perhaps the former in an ivory tower of sorts. By referring to a different world of Christians, the homily diverges from the Dionysian standpoint that Christians do not differ from the rest of people by land. However, the different world of Christians, the passage shows further, refers to their worldview and ethos. It is a matter of existential variance, not separate topography. Another difference from the Dionysian discourse is the reference to the Christians as different manner of speech, whereas Diognetus points out that Christians do not differ from the rest of people by language. The manner of speech in the homily refers, however, to a distinguished use of language, not the adoption of an incomprehensible idiom. It goes the same for their dissimilar activities. Apart from these differences, overall the homily follows Diognetus in depicting the paradox of Christians being indigenized without loss of their ethos. But the divide between Christians and the world is more emphatic here than in Diognetus, whose author wrote about a Christian minority marginalized and persecuted. Given the supposed time frame of the homily's redaction, namely the Constantinian era, when Christians gained political freedom, the above passage exhibits a surprising sharpness. Against what one may have expected within the political context, it draws on an emphatic line between Christians and the world. In so doing, the homily echoes another manifestation of discontent during that age, the rise of monasticism as a mass phenomenon. The early monastic literature, with which I cannot concern myself here, indeed affirms a similar difference between ascetics and the world. The agreement of these sources is telling. For both, however, the world is no longer the pagan society. The world is the Christians who fuse with that society and its standards. Given this understanding of the world, it is obvious that the homily addresses a problem within Christianity itself. In a masterful turn, and supposedly on behalf of a Christian, possibly ascetic elite, the homily converts the manifesto of Diognetus into a diatribe against fellow Christians. In chapter 4 we read, "Although like those of the world the crowds believe that the difference and distinction refers to forms and signs, the strangeness of Christians does not consist in outward forms and signs." The internal polarization is obvious. Christian crowds adopt a worldly cast of mind. In the light of this understanding, the passage, which echoes Diognetus even more than the previous one, clarifies the statement concerning the different world of Christians. For a Macarian believer, since Christian strangeness does not consist in outward forms and signs, the different world of Christians refers to an interiorized reality, not a geographical location. To paraphrase Louis once more, for a Macarian believer, the different world of Christians refers to their internal self-identity. In turn, the crowds take it to signify a different space and its corresponding attributes, an external, observed identity. This is definitely no longer the Dionysian universe where views categories represent the two sides of a coin. Here they designate two different Christian groups, nurturing different understandings of the Christian ethos. What we read within the above passage and its context is that, like the people of this world, and not unlike the Jews of Diognetus 4, the Christian crowds are interested in outward forms and signs. Their identity transferred from within into the open amounts to religious formalism. For them to be a Christian is about external distinctiveness. This being the case, then the diatribe against worldly Christians could be likewise aimed at the idiosyncratic monks of the second generation. If that were so, the homily adds to a chorus of accusations. The shallow adherence of later monks to the initial monastic manifesto is explicitly deplored by the alphabetic collection of the Apophthegmata and Nilus's ascetic discourse. By contrast, the interiorized ethos of Macarian believers embodies their thinking and mindset of the soul, which abides in the peace of Christ and the love of the Spirit, together with a state of serenity, stability, and calm. As they do not require an external distinctiveness from the world, to achieve holiness, Macarian believers do not need to adopt the monastic habit either. Their spiritual identity is established through commitment to an internalized gospel. In short, the homily transfers intramuros the Diognetan polarity between Christians and non-Christians by drawing a line between true and false Christians, or true and false monks for that matter. The Macarian true Christian inherits the traits of Diognetus' unqualified Christian, whereas the Diognetan non-Christian becomes the Macarian representation of the false Christian and pseudomorphic monk. The outdoors line of division in Diognetus becomes in the homily an indoors partition, a move which very likely reflects the reaction of certain elitist milieus to the degradation recorded during the Constantinian age of Christian and monastic massification. Apart from this variance of focus, the commonality of concerns and phraseology proves indisputably that the Macarian fifth spiritual homily draws on Diognetus directly or indirectly. In so doing, it proves that Diognetus as either text or message did not pass into oblivion, and that, on the contrary, its message continued to be the favorite way of expressing Christian identity, albeit not without a reinterpretation of its meaning. And in my extended paper, there's much more there. I included a reference to Augustine and his two cities, and particularly a very interesting position that the two cities are found both in the world and in the church, which is something that echoes, I guess, the Macarian position or the Macarian rewriting of the Diognetan message. Well,